Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I wanted to thank everyone who watches the channel and leaves comments. I recently decided to demonetize the channel, so I'm no longer running ads. Several people have asked me if I would re-release some of my favorite stories without the advertisements. I also wanted to thank Jake at Family History Storybooks. He's doing a storybook about my great-great-grandfather, Mariner Wood Merrill. He will write the stories for you. I've chosen to write the dialogue myself. If you just give him the name of one of your ancestors, he does these beautiful illustrated storybooks so that you can share the stories of your ancestors with your progenitors. I have 3 great stories today. I had the privilege of working in a single adult ward in Provo for 6 years and just loved it. It was wonderful working with the youth. When we first received the calling, my wife said, I don't want to go to church with a bunch of kids every week. And then we did, and we came home after the first week, and Sherry said, I hope they never send us back to the home ward. It was just a wonderful privilege. But part of my calling as a counselor was to set apart members of the ward when they received a new calling. And in a student ward, it turns over every semester. People move in and out, and at least half the callings in the ward are renewed every semester. So a great deal of my time was spent setting people apart and giving them the authorities and rights and responsibilities associated with their calling. My assistant, Alex Thompson, would assist me. And on one particular day, a young man was coming in, and I can't remember his name. I can't remember what calling he got. And I do remember that Alex had to tell me his name when he came into the room because I'd never met him. And I put my hands on his head and set him apart in his calling, gave him the privileges associated with that calling. And then very clearly, I was told to tell him something. I said, several months ago, you had a substantial question in your life, and you fasted and prayed about it, and you received an answer. But you've procrastinated acting on that answer. And through the time since you got that answer, you've begun to think that maybe you imagined it, and that really wasn't from the Lord. He wants you to know that that answer was from God. And he still wants you to do it. And this great big burly kid, after the blessing, got up and he had tears running down his cheeks, and so did I. The Spirit had been very strong. He said, Brother Merrill, how did you know that? But the voice of the Lord came into my mind, and I knew that he needed to know that. It was a special experience. It's one that's helped me realize that when someone is set apart in a calling, whatever it is, the Lord will allow them the information they need to fulfill that calling. Another story I'd like to share comes from the early 1900s out of Scipio, Utah. There was a young man who was a teacher in the ward, and he had heard the older boys that previous fall after the hunting season talking about how they'd ridden their horses up to the top of the mountains east of Scipio, and that the view was spectacular. They could see almost to Salt Lake County. They could see into Sevier County and out towards Delta and that big valley, and way down to the south to the Tusher Mountains. And it was just a spectacular view. And all winter long, he had kind of envied their experience. And late in the spring, he one day finished up his chores early, and he snuck in the house and made a sandwich and filled his canteen and decided today's the day I'm going to climb up there, take a look at that view. So he worked his way up the ridge lines and along the spine, and he got up there in the afternoon, had his sandwich, and just enjoyed the spectacular vista that lay before him. And then as the day was growing long, he decided, I better get home. And he realized that the path that he had taken up would take a lot more time than daylight would allow. And he looked down off this mountain and he thought, I can just hike straight down this way. Things went fine for a while. It was just a real steep slope. But pretty soon he started to come to little cliff lines. And at first they weren't that big. He was able to maneuver down these cliff lines, find a crack, and kind of work his way down. And then he came to a pretty good sizable cliff, about 15 feet tall. And he worked his way down a crack, and he was trying to hold on, and he fell. And he landed on his feet and then tumbled onto his back. And he turned and gathered himself and looked down ahead of him, and he thought that the slope just continued after that cliff that he'd fallen off of. But it didn't. He realized that there was a 60-foot cliff in front of him. And he thought, I got to get out of here. And so he went over to the far right and over to the far left. And both times the little talus slope that he was on just tapered into nothing. And there was nothing but cliff on all sides. He had this 15-foot cliff, and he thought, I've got to climb back up. And he tried to jump up and grab the little ledge that he'd held onto and fallen off of, and he couldn't get up to it. And he tried to get a grip with his boots and his hands and work up there. He just couldn't, and he worked on it, and he worked on it, and finally he gave up. And he sat down and took the last drink out of his canteen, and he looked at the situation. He had his back up against this cliff. He thought, no one knows I'm up here. What am I going to do? And then he decided, I need God's help. So he knelt down and he prayed and he pled with the Lord and explained his situation. And he was desperate. This poor kid was just desperate because here he was. It was a late spring day. It was going to get cold that night. He had just had his last water. He had no food. He didn't have a coat. And nobody knew where he was. After he prayed and explained all this situation to the Lord, he stood up and he walked over to the edge of the cliff, and down below him was a huge pine tree, and its limbs reached up and stopped about 15 feet below him. And he had the impression that those limbs could catch you. He thought, I can't do that. So he hiked back over to the right, and he looked everywhere. He just searched. He searched for some way to crawl up this cliff behind him. Went back to the left, and he just studied the cliff all the way down, looking for a place to climb up, and there was nowhere that he could climb up. The sun was getting near the horizon, and he was getting desperate because the winds were starting to come down off the mountain. It was starting to have a chill in the air. He knelt down again and said, please, God, there's got to be a way for me to get off this ledge. Help somebody find me. And he got up, and he realized no one would find him up there. In his heart, he knew that the only way down was to follow the impression he'd gotten. So he walked over the edge of the cliff. When he was directly above the tree, he backed up until his back was right against the cliff. And then he tried to gather his courage. He took several breaths, and then with 3 or 4 giant steps, he got all the momentum he could, and he leapt off this cliff. And for a moment, he thought, what have I done? And then he hit the tree and started to crash down through the branches, and finally a big branch caught him right in the solar plexus and knocked the wind out of him. But he hung there, clotheslined over this big limb, and he was able to get a hold of the trunk. He was still quite high in the tree, and the tree was kind of swinging a little bit, but it stopped. He stopped. He was able to sit down on the branch for a minute. Then he crawled down through all the branches, dropped down out of the last branch, and as he walked home, as the day drew to a close, he thanked the Lord for saving him. Probably needed a little help when he got home, because I bet his mom was pretty mad too. My last story is one I've told to several people in my life. I have a dear friend that joined me in Gander, Newfoundland. It was in the middle of the winter. Newfoundland is cold, and Gander is particularly cold. I had many experiences with Dano McDay. One of them, we were out knocking on doors. That's all we did in Gander, pretty much, was knocking on doors. And a young man, probably 25 years old, 30 years old, let us into his house. And when he closed the door, Dano said, "Is that a Strat?" And there was a Stratocaster guitar leaned against the wall behind the front door. And the guy said, "Do you play?" And boy, did he play. This elder took that guitar and started I couldn't believe. He was so talented on the guitar and still is. It's amazing. And here's a picture of him playing in a punk rock band that he formed a long time ago. After his mission, he went to college, and he was probably not as serious as some people about college, and he did well. He worked full-time and went to school full-time. He met a wonderful girl, Mary Ellen. They're some of our favorite people in the world. She convinced Dano that he should become an attorney. So he started sending out applications to all the law schools around, and it was a very frustrating, discouraging time of his life. And finally, he was accepted to Lewis and Clark. And Dano was thrilled to have the opportunity to go to school. He joined the Army so they would help pay for his schooling, because he knew that he couldn't work full-time and become an attorney. After 2 years, Mary Ellen's father was diagnosed with cancer, and so they moved back to Utah, and he was accepted to finish his last year in law school at Brigham Young University so that Mary Ellen could be closer to her father. After he graduated, he passed the bar, and then he became a JAG. I'm not a person that sends out Christmas cards, but by far my favorite Christmas card I've ever gotten was from Dano and Mary Ellen, and this is a copy of that Christmas card. And it shows you what kind of humor this guy has. He's fun to be around. So's his wife. After his time in the Army was finished, he came back to Utah, and he sent out applications to every law firm in the western United States. And Dano's the kind of guy that carries his own weight, but he could not get a job as an attorney. So he did something that is incredibly telling of his personality and his character. He became a law clerk for Salt Lake County. And part of his duty was to go up to the state capitol, and when he'd go up to the state capitol, he'd always look at the bulletin board and see what jobs were there. And one day he saw a job advertising a position as an environmental attorney. And when he saw it, the Spirit confirmed to him, "You are going to get that job." And Dano's a very humble man, and he didn't even dare tell his wife about this, but he applied for the job, continued to work as a law clerk for the county. Time passed. The interview process began, and he made the first cut, and he made the second cut. He made the third cut. And at that point, Mary Ellen had the opportunity to talk to the only other candidate that had made the third cut. And it was a woman that was a very good attorney. As Mary Ellen spoke with her, the Spirit confirmed to Mary Ellen that Dano was going to get that job. So that evening, as they were talking, Mary Ellen said, "Dano, you're going to get that job." And he took courage and said, "I know, the Spirit confirmed to me that I was going to get it." And she said, "The Spirit confirmed to me that you're going to get that job." So with that confirmation in mind, Dano took courage, and he went to work the next day, and he told his boss, "This is my notice, because I'm going to get that job." And he told the people at work, the law students that were studying to be attorneys, that he was going to get this coveted position as an environmental attorney. And then the announcement was made. He didn't get the job. Dano began to question, did he even know what the voice of the Lord was? When he had had the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon and a witness that Joseph Smith was a true prophet, when he knew he should go on a mission, when he felt that he should marry his wife, did he just imagine those feelings? It was a difficult time. We had dinner with them not long after this experience, and he was in turmoil. Dano just could hardly understand why the Lord would tell him he was going to get that job and give him the courage to tell people at work he was going to get it, and then have it pulled out from under him and not get it. And he was questioning everything in his life. Weeks went by, months went by, and then the phone rang. The man that was the main attorney for Utah at the time in the Environmental Law Department was retiring. And the lady that had gotten the job moved up, and she called Dano and told him that she'd like to look at his resume. Dano told me that he thought she might have been blinded when she saw it, because the classes that were most required for this position were ones that he had not done well in, but he got the job. But there was a time, it wasn't as long as Abraham and Sarah, but there was a time that Mary Ellen and Dano had to just step forward into the darkness and trust that that still small voice was the voice of the Lord. Usually, the Lord's time is not like our time, but his voice is a still small voice that reaches your heart. I know that God speaks to me. I've had many experiences in my life where I have known the voice of the Lord. I know the Lord loves all of his children. He loves you, and he loves me. And he will guide and direct our lives for good. And sometimes the things that we are promised may not happen for decades, but the word of the Lord is true and sure, and they will happen. This has been Brother Merrill's Inspirational Stories. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please subscribe. Here's another story you might like. And if you like that, you may like all of Brother Merrill's Inspirational Stories. Thanks again for listening.